But again, I don't know what it is. So
Hello. Welcome to the Backpack Show. It's April Fool's Day.
I have none of that in me. Like I have no I've just read through a whole bunch of the April Fools. Here's what I saw that I liked. There's a comment that April Fool's Day is basically Halloween for brands.
I
I like that.
used to
I'll
switch
accept that.
podcasts with somebody on April Fool's Day. That used to be a thing that I would do. And then one person in the history of me doing it was like, I can't do that. My audience expects that I'm going to be. I was like, okay. And I decided I wasn't dealing with that anymore.
Weird.
But it's kind of fun. But there's no jokes today. This is a
no,
great,
right. We're gonna talk about a lot of girls. A lot of girls.
Yes. We're going to talk about women who were called girls because they broke out of traditional gender roles to achieve success in their own way at a time when women were expected to do like traditional women things.
And just to correct anyone else who heard it the way I heard it the first time, not call girls women who were called girls.
Okay.
Hi everyone, Tim Kitzrow from NBA Jam and NFL Blitz, welcoming you to The Backpack Show. Your hosts, Chris Brogan, Carrie Gargone, Boom Shakalaka.
Backpack Show.
I think people are going to be disappointed. I bet they expected you to prank them. Like you of all people.
No, I know, but I'm not. I'm so not into that.
I know.
I want to talk to Kathleen Stone. Somebody said that April Fool's is a holiday to celebrate the people's inability to know how to tell a joke.
Oof.
Which I
don't know.
I can get with.
I don't like to prank people when they're expecting it. So.
Right. Yeah. Huzzah.
Yeah.
All right.
But you should thank a sponsor before we bring Kathleen in.
Yeah, we should thank some sponsors.
And don't make fun of them just because it's April Fool's.
Yeah. Thanks, crappy sponsor. All right. Hey, podcasting people. Want a podcast? You can have one. We do.
Sure
we
do.
use castos.com to host it. It's pretty good. It's my friend Matthew Medeiros puts it together with some friends. Actually, I don't think he has anything to do with it. He's just a typist. And it's called Castos, and you can go there, get some podcasts. Hey, want a .online domain? You can have girls.online. Probably don't buy that.
Yeah, don't do that.
cbrogan.me/online. You can get one for $1 whole dollaroo. You just have to type in Chris out the code, the purchase code, all caps.
That's no joke. The code has to be in all caps.
Not April Fool's.
No.
Hey, would you like a show sponsored by a peacock? You can. cbrogan.me/StreamYard.
And not a peacock.
Oh, see, April Fools. Yeah. Gosh, do you remember when your kids are 5 and they try to do April Fools and they're just so wrong? Like you go around a corner and they just
/StreamYard.
hit you in the head with a bar of soap and they're like, April Fools.
But it's like that with every joke. They'll be like, whoa, why did the chicken cross the road? Because it hated hamburgers. And you're like, what? They're still learning.
You want a search engine that's not Google? You can have one. Presearch.com.
You know what? It's a darn fine search engine. It works really well. And if you're logged in, you get crypto rewards for using it. And you can use the crypto rewards to stake a page for something. So if you know where the good muffin shop is in Nashville, Tennessee, you could stake muffins in Nashville and direct people to that site.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say, I think we're almost done sponsoring research. Every time we do that, then Kate comes, and then I get to talk to Kate.
Oh, and then she comes in and gives you more. Yeah. All right, bring Kathleen out. She's probably
Chloe and Leslie.
Really tired of listening to us make terrible jokes. Hi, Leslie.
What's up, girls?
No more peacocks. Oh, dear.
No more peacocks. Hi, Kathleen Stone. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Chris. Hi, Carrie.
Leslie says, I was the queen of April Fool's jokes in the workplace, but always made sure it was someone who could take the joke. That's tricky, though, isn't it? Because it depends in part on the nature of the joke and the day on which you choose to present it, because you just never know. So before you make it obvious that it was you, maybe give it a minute. Because you want the flexibility to be like, yeah, that's terrible, if it turns out they're really mad about it. Leave that mystery unsolved.
In some ways, Kathleen, you're a lot like the people in your book, because you went on to do something that you weren't necessarily set up to do. You weren't particularly an author. You were a lawyer. And then you decided, I think I'll write a book.
Right.
Who put this bad idea in your head that you should write a book?
That's a great idea.
Well, before I tell you the answer to that, I want to tell you something about April Fools in Boston, which is where I am. 25 years ago today, we had a big snowstorm. It shut down the city. All the trees had started to bud. We had a lot of snow. The limbs crashed down. I remember my son was 5 years old at the time. He stayed home for the day. We made snowmen. It was just one of those great days on April Fools. So that was our joke in Boston.
I was in Tewksbury managing a directory assistance call center, and I had all kinds of stranded operators. So that at the end of their shift, we had to cart them up the highway to this hotel that was like a half a mile from the call center. So I shoveled a lot of cars on that holiday.
Okay, so you remember it too.
Oh, vividly. That was quite the April Fool's.
I did not go to work that day. And then my boss was mad because I worked at a university and it was not canceled or whatever. And I said, cool, but I think it's paternalistic to expect the university to decide for me if it's safe enough for me to go. So I decided it was not. And actually, she was like, okay with that for some reason. And she did not call me girl. So I feel like I came out. I call that a win.
We call it a win. So let's talk about the book. What made you think this was a good idea that you need to write a book like this? What pushed this in front of you and said you're going to do this?
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Years and years in the making. In two senses of that. One is the idea was somehow implanted in my brain when I was a young girl. And in fact, I write about this in the introduction to the book. I remember looking at my father's yearbook from his law school class. He graduated from law school in 1950. As a young girl, flipping through the pages, seeing the pictures, mostly men, overwhelmingly men, but there were a few women. I didn't know them. I didn't know any woman who was a lawyer. In my neighborhood, most of the women were like my mother, homes, taking care of kids. But I knew that somewhere in the world, some women existed who went to a job like the one my father had. And I just wanted to know, who were these women? What made them think they could do something like that? So that was, an idea I had when I was maybe 8 years old. And then it subsided and I went on with my own life. And I went to law school myself when I was in my 20s. Partly my father's influence. Although, as I learned writing the book and thinking about how we all become who we are, I realized my mother's influence was really profound. I just didn't realize it so much at the time. But then, years into my own career as a lawyer, I think I was, thinking, what else do I want to do with my life? Is this all there is? And I thought, I had never really figured out what about that older generation. And I thought, well, now's the time to find out because these women won't be around forever. So why don't I start talking to some of them and asking them the questions that had resurfaced in my mind? So that was sort of how it all came together. And then it did take me a really long time to do the research and the writing.
Well, how did you decide who you wanted to speak to and how did you find them? Like the older generation, not to be stereotypical, but they can be tricky to find. They're not like all over Twitter or LinkedIn like people are now, right? They don't self-identify. So how did you find them?
I did not find them on TikTok, that's for sure. Well, I started by doing some just basic research about women's history. I read books, I did online research. I went to the library. I even looked in the children's section at the public library, the books of famous women that, they give to young children, looking for sort of leads of how I would find the women I wanted to talk to. And that didn't produce anything. I wasn't going to interview Cleopatra or,
Amelia
like
Earhart.
that.
Good luck with that. Right. That would be the exclusive of the century.
Right. But my online research did produce a few names, and I did reach out to several of those women, and actually got a couple. The first one was age. I was looking for women who were of my mother's generation, because those were, that's who initially interested me. My mother had passed away by the time I started this, but I was looking she was born in 1922. So I was looking for women essentially of that age group. I ended up with 7 women. I think the earliest birth date is 1913 and the most recent is 1932. So that's the age span that I was working with. Then I was looking for women who went into professional fields that were male dominated, fields like medicine, law, science. I was really looking for women who had taken an unconventional path and had decided, I'm not going to follow the expectations of what women are supposed to do. I'm going to do what I want to do. So I was looking for those kind of women.
Boy, did you find it with people like Cordelia Hood, though. I think she's your 1913, by the way.
Absolutely.
Cordelia worked for the OSS before it was known as the CIA. And she worked there for some duration of time, married her husband out of the Frankfurt office, divorced him, and stayed married to the CIA until 1970, the year of my birth. So how did you pick Cordelia Hood? I mean, she's clearly exciting, but like, where did you get your material and who did you have to shake down to talk to that superstar?
It's interesting you pick her out of all of them. She was a family friend, actually. So I was going to say, after all the research I did, all the Googling, all the reading, my personal network really was the biggest help to me in finding the women. People
what was her cover story? Was she pretend to be like a clown or a baker or like?
Well, she was like a communications agent more than other things, right?
She was an intelligence analyst. She started in OSS during World War II, first in London and then in Bern, Switzerland, which was the European headquarters of OSS. And she worked with Alan Dulles, who eventually became director of the CIA after the war. She wasn't like putting on a disguise or pretending to be someone else. Her job was to find out, when she was in Switzerland anyway, find out what the Germans in Switzerland were up to. And one of her major sources were the Swiss Federal Police, because the Swiss, despite being neutral and maintaining their neutrality so that they weren't actually invaded by the Germans, they were also keeping tabs on the Germans. And it was her job to find out what they knew about what the Germans were doing. And she had a particular in that allowed her to do that, which is that she graduated from college in 1936 and then went to Europe for a couple of years. Initially, she went to France to learn French. She knew some French, but to perfect her French. And then she traveled through Italy, parts of Germany, and ended up in Austria. And while she was in Austria, she went up into the mountains and learned the Swiss German dialect, which is a very peculiar, difficult dialect. No one else in the OSS office knew it, and she did. And that's what the Swiss police spoke. So she became the real conduit to them for getting information. But she there were Americans in Switzerland during the war. She talked to them. There were Italians. She talked to whomever she could to find out what the Germans were up to. And it was really a counterintelligence position, not just finding out what they were doing, but what did they know about the Americans? It was sort of almost a defensive position. So that's how I knew her, and that's what she was doing.
Carol was asking, are these women who joined the workforce in male-dominated fields before World War II when men went off to war? Like, in other words, did they just take advantage of kind of the vacuum, or did they push those openings beforehand?
Absolutely, they started beforehand. For Cordelia, no, really. She was in graduate school getting her master's degree in German. The war was for her an opening. And actually, before World War II, there was no civilian intelligence service. The war was the impetus to create that. So the job that she then had didn't exist before the war. But she was not a Rosie the Riveter type figure who took sort of a manufacturing job or a men's job that was then vacated by men going off to war. Other women that I write about definitely started their careers before the war. One of them is Dr. Muriel Pettione. She was the only woman in her medical school class and graduated in 1937. So she started her medical career long before the war, or at least before the United States got involved in the war.
That had to have been a lot of fun, being the only woman in your medical school class.
Yeah, and she noted the fact that she was the only woman. She didn't dwell on it. She didn't dwell on it as a hardship or a difficulty. She was Black. She grew up in Harlem. She eventually returned to Harlem. In fact, her nickname became the Mother of Medicine in Harlem because she became so influential in the community. And when I asked her, what was it like to be both Black and female at a time when medical care was segregated, women weren't particularly going into fields like medicine. She was the only woman in her class. She basically said it wasn't a problem. I was middle class. Her father had gone to medical school also. He was a doctor and very prominent in the Harlem community as well. And she had a family who could afford for her to go to college. Her father had also gone to Howard University Medical School, which is where she went. And she just thought that she had the kind of upbringing that gave her an entree that so many other women didn't have. So she just passed, the idea that it was a challenge wasn't something that she was going to spend very much time thinking about.
Because race and gender at that time both had, a lot of a push to it. But to your point, Harlem in that time frame, class mattered a great deal as well. This is before, all the turbulence of the 60s and all the hard, the Jim Crow and all those kinds of things. So this was almost this like pocket moment where someone like her, she could exist, Dr. Pettione.
Yeah. In fact, her family moved to Harlem in 1919. She was actually born in Trinidad. Her father was basically kicked out of Trinidad. He was a journalist and he was writing anti-colonial pieces as a writer. And he was, as she put it, invited to leave. So they moved to Harlem as the Harlem Renaissance was beginning to flower. It was a period of great optimism in Harlem. And she just sort of drank in that optimism, both from the community and I think from her father, who saw that although he had just gotten kicked out of Trinidad, he had a path ahead in New York. And it's not that he didn't understand and that she, as she grew older, didn't understand there was racial segregation. She went south after she got out of medical school, worked at a number of historically Black colleges in the South during Jim Crow, when segregation was not only legal, it was mandatory. She was obviously fully aware of that. But that, she just carved out a really interesting, productive life for herself without dwelling and trying to change it, those just practices, but without dwelling on it as a negative.
Carol says, my mom and I both have math degrees. My mom was one of 3 girls in her class. I was one of about 10%. Today, I think it's 50-50. I am not the 50% that would love to be in math class. It's just not my thing.
Nor am I.
Well, we're lawyers. Lawyers are better with words, right?
Yeah, but I actually in the book I put in little bits about my own path to becoming a lawyer, including the fact that when I was in high school, my math teacher told me to take calculus the following year, and I didn't, because in my mind, girls weren't supposed to be good at math. Somehow I thought it was unfeminine or I was intimidated. I don't think if I had taken calculus in high school, it would have probably really affected my life's trajectory. But I wish I had done it. I wish I could say, yes, I did it.
And there are definitely people who view law as not feminine, by the way. Like, at least the picture they have in their mind of a lawyer as a zealous advocate is directly at odds with the sort of shrinking violet feminine personality that was kind of put forward as the ideal.
Absolutely.
But you went for it anyway.
I did. I think there's all kinds of ways you can be a good lawyer. You can be a zealot advocate. You can be a crazy type lawyer, and we've seen a lot of them on TV in the last few years. You can be a cerebral, intellectual lawyer. There's all kinds of. You can be an advocate for social justice. There's a lot of things you can do as a lawyer. So even though I tend to actually to be a fairly quiet personality, I thought that there was a role for me in the field, and there turned out to be.
My kid's godmother was a lawyer, really good one, and people never saw her coming because she was tall, slender, blonde, and very soft spoken, and then she would just clean their clock. So that's what happened. One little step at a time. And at the end, they'd be like, they would love her anyway, even though she just did that. So when you were making your way into law yourself, how did you find time for this project? Because this is a fairly significant project, and law is not like an undemanding career.
No, law is definitely a demanding career. I really started this book project late in my career as a lawyer. I guess I had left my firm, and I was a solo practitioner. I certainly had clients, but I had some discretion on what to take on and how to use my time. So that gave me a little bit of maneuver room. Although the other thing that I did as part of the book project was that I went back to school. I went and decided to get my Master of Fine Arts in creative writing as part of weaning myself away from being a legal writer into a narrative nonfiction writer. Because as you know, writing legal briefs doesn't lend itself to great storytelling. It's much more analysis of the law, and nobody in their right mind really wants to read that.
No. Let's go there for a minute, though. So narrative nonfiction, a relatively new writing style, by the way. I mean, it's only been around for a couple of decades. There are some incredible examples of it. Who's on your reading list that you said as you were writing this book, gosh, if I could even feel a little bit like this kind of person, I would feel pretty happy with myself? Like, who are your kind of like secret heroes that you hoped that the book would, nod to as far as writing style goes and, that sort of thing?
I read a number of group biographies, which is really the sort of subgenre that my book is. I'm trying to see how books were structured when they were dealing with different people who didn't necessarily know each other. There certainly are group biographies of tight cohorts who were friends. My women didn't know one another. Lyndall Gordon wrote a book called Outsiders about women. I think they're all British, who were, including Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, who didn't know one another, but all found their way as artists and writers. And she focuses on each one individually, but then you can draw some general conclusions about what it took to become an artist, a writer throughout history. So that was one of the books that helped me think about structure. But another book that is very different, and it's not a group biography, it was more a memoir that helped me feel that I could and should use my own voice as a writer, was Hope Jaron's book, Lab Girl, where she writes about being a grad student and then a scientist and a teacher. She puts a lot of herself into the book. Obviously, it's her story, but you feel like she's talking to you personally. And that really helped me break through some of the almost inhibitions I felt from having done legal writing for so long, where you don't put yourself in the story. It made me feel that I could and should put myself in the story, both in terms of the scenes with the women that I'm writing about, but also my own story. when I was a kid or I was going to law school or whatever. The other thing that helped me with that, the sort of the personal approach, was being at Bennington to get my MFA. Both the students in my workshops and my teachers encouraged me to write more personally. I workshopped some very early drafts of some of the chapters in the book, and they felt, even to me, dry, boring, and I needed to figure out how to shake that up a little bit. And one of my classmates said, you have the credentials, having been a lawyer, to really help us to become the navigator. Help us get through what you're writing. Essentially take us by the hand as the writer and show us what you saw. We'll see it on our own as well, but you take us under your wing and take us to meet these women. So that hearing that from another student really helped me see some possibilities of how to deal with the material that I had accumulated through all the interviews.
It never dawned on me, and I know Carrie as a lawyer probably would be like, well, duh. But to me, what you just said is almost like that, like preponderance of evidence kind of a situation. There's a certain part of being a lawyer that is to be thorough. And that is not accurate in book authoring whatsoever. The book author's idea is to say that you spy a purple jacket in the closet, and that should let you know that there's probably other colored jackets in the closet, because if there's one purple one, there's going to be crazy things in there, So I wonder if that's, like a switch that flipped in you where you're like, okay, I don't have to create the ocean. I have to say that there's a delicious fish on my plate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually like that about the delicious fish on my plate. I wasn't doing a full life biography of any of these women. I was coming at it as to why they had the ambition they did and how they pulled it off against the odds, and anything either in their personal story or in terms of historical context that had a bearing on those particular questions is what I focused on.
Carol's wondering how many of those women had children ultimately.
The majority, I think 5 out of 7.
Did you, when you were putting it together, find that any of them were surprising to you? Like, it might on the surface seem like a boring thing for a woman to want to take on a certain role if the job itself is not glamorous, like counterintelligence is glamorous. So was there anybody that you thought would be just sort of a ho-hum story of, hey, I super wanted to be like a bricklayer, and so I did it, but you discovered that the story was much richer, or that they had a lot more, that there was just a lot more to it than you realized?
There were always layers that I discovered in talking to the women. I'm thinking about Judge Ria Zobel. She's the last chapter in the book. She was actually the last interview I did. I knew she was a federal judge. In and of itself, that's pretty interesting. What I did not know, because she hadn't really given many interviews, at least none that I could track down before I met her, what I did not know was that she had lived in Germany during World War II. She was on one of the first UN refugee ships to arrive in the United States, and she had been orphaned at the end of the war. Both of her parents were taken away by Soviet soldiers right at the end of the war. And from there, she made her way to Harvard Law School. That was eye-opening to me. I had no idea that was the story I was about to hear.
Wow.
She's also the story that gave me the title for the book. When she graduated from Harvard in 1956, which was only, I think, the third class at Harvard that had any women at all, she wanted to get a job with a law firm. She could not get a job with a law firm. They simply weren't hiring women. And as she told me in the interview, we weren't called women, we were called girls. And 20 years later, she was on the federal bench, but it took a while.
What did these girls have in common that led them to achieve success in areas that traditionally weren't considered appropriate? Like what characteristics did they share?
They all had an incredible sense of self, self-confidence, and an understanding that they had particular interests and talents, and that they would be happier if they were able to use those interests and talents in a role other than housewife and mother. Now, of course, they all had home lives. Most of them had children. That wasn't something that they divorced themselves from entirely. They just incorporated an outside work life as well. So I think it really is a sense of self, an idea that they should have agency over their own lives. And
the nerve.
I know. And a lot of that comes from their families. Some families were pretty explicitly ambitious on their behalf. Some families said, you are going to college, when that was still fairly unusual. But others didn't. But I think all of the women as youngsters picked up from their families a sense of optimism, a sense of self, a sort of a can-do attitude. Even those who grew up without any advantages at all. One woman grew up in great poverty. Her father didn't work at all. Her mother had unskilled labor jobs. But her mother was also optimistic that despite the difficulties of her life and the difficulties of her providing for the family, things would be better for her children. And I think that the woman somehow picked up a sense of optimism and a story that things would be better, and incorporated that into her outlook.
I'm thinking as I listened to that, and I was thinking a little bit specifically about the sense of self, the need for agency, and all that. It's amazing to your point that they didn't have to necessarily be, amazing roles. They could have done a semi-mundane sort of role, but done it very well, just because of how they felt or what they felt that they needed to express or distribute through that role. So, for instance, someone could be the shopkeeper, but be an incredible shopkeeper. They could be a seamstress, but that someone was just like rock solid for 42 years as a seamstress. The only challenge is that history sure doesn't leave a lot of notes around for a seamstress, and so I guess that's probably kind of how you choose what you choose. That leads me to a transitional question, which is this enough? Are you a one book woman, or did you finish this and go, oh, here we go, next book, I'm ready?
Well, what I was writing before or even while I was working on this, was I've been doing a lot of art reviews and book reviews. And I took a little bit of a hiatus in order to do the final push to get this book completed and out. But I'm going back to doing that. And in terms of another book, I've got a couple of ideas. One is putting a spotlight on women who had not professional jobs like doctor, lawyer, but jobs like truck driver and bricklayer. My son is a commercial truck driver, and I know something about vocational education from being with him on his path. And I think that there's still a big way for women to develop in some of those fields. And I think that's where my next focus might be in terms of a book.
Deb thinks you need to throw like a salon. Like, sort of sounds like you hosted a get together to introduce these women, like over coffee or lunch, to other people who would find them interesting. You were the connector. So I would show up for that. You wouldn't show up for that.
I once had a dream that, as I said, my mother had passed away before I started this book, and she didn't know any of these women. But I once had a dream that my mother and I were together with all the women, and I was in fact introducing my mother to these women. The dream happened years ago. I thought about writing about that in the book, and then I thought, well, that's a little schmaltzy. That doesn't really quite work, so I didn't. But now that you mention it, thanks for the question. It just brought back that memory.
It's a great memory. Well, we've hit a certain spot in our show where we have to do a couple things that we do every episode. Here's one of them.
Oh, and here's our person of the day. Kaboom!
And our person of the day. Boy, I mean, it's if I go on volume, I'm going Carol. Carol was right hooked into this particular episode. So, Carol, you are our math degreed person of the day. You had comment plus comment equals the most comments.
Which gets you one really good apple. You just have to buy it, wash it, and bake it into a tartlet or something. But if you think that that's too feminine a pursuit, you could just eat the thing. I don't know.
Yes, you could. Now,
I like baking.
Here's a question we ask every person who's ever been on the show, from Sister Anne Flanagan to, I don't know, Mistress Harley, the financial dominatrix. This is the question. What goes in your backpack? By the way, let's talk about someone who had quite a different career choice. What goes in your backpack? This could be something physical, like an avocado. It could be something metaphorical, like hope for the future. Carrie, what's something physical you could throw in a backpack?
Extra set of teeth.
I think an extra set of teeth is good. What would be a metaphorical thing one might ever add to a backpack?
Kindness. I think you just can never have enough of it.
Kindness is a good one. We're at that spot, Kathleen Stone. What would you like to add to the backpack?
I think I would add optimism. Having looked at these women and where they came from and where they ended up, and looking at the historical period that they spanned, I see a lot of progress having been made. I am not at all blind to ways that we still need to get better, in a whole host of ways, including for women in the country and all over the world. But I'm optimistic that we can persevere and get it done. So I think I would take optimism with me. I think that can get you through. You're realistic about the challenges, but you're optimistic you can meet them.
Big fan of the optimism. I think that's a good
Speaking of optimism, look at this chat. Carol's like, Dave, and Dave's like, Carol. And now I can picture them running toward each other in a field of wildflowers.
It's Canadians. They support each other no matter when and where.
That's so sweet. People from Boston are like, oh, you're here.
Cool. So in World War II, my grandfather was a radar operator in the Bermuda Triangle. And to anybody's knowledge, my grandmother did not serve. But there is a possibility that she had some knowledge of the OSS and some of their goings on. And it was because of her work in a paper mill in Augusta, Maine. And here's where that connects.